Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Kallipolis Radio. Today, I'll be reading another short story by Leonard. This one's titled, Looking for the Moon. Thanks for listening. As a quick note before we begin, this story was submitted by one of our listeners. If you'd like to submit a story, you can reach me at my email or through Instagram, which are both linked in the channel description. Secondly, Leonard has been so kind as to provide his voice for one of the characters in the story. If you like his work, you can check him out at his Instagram, which is linked in the video description. Enjoy. Wallace Cannon walked out onto the porch of his parents' farmhouse when he happened to notice that the horizon was missing something far beyond the cornfield. What? He asked himself upon squinting into the distance. The sun was hanging onto the horizon, but was slipping, its orange light diminishing where Wallace looked, for the sun set behind the farmhouse, and Wallace was looking adjacent. There were 6 Coors Banquets in the mini-fridge on the porch, and they were about as creamy as the sunset, but Wallace hadn't even opened the fridge. He had become transfixed, mid-leaning down when he was reaching for the fridge, but it would never open that night. Wait a minute. He drew away from the fridge, limping lazily to the railing of the porch. He flipped his hair out of his face and looked into the horizon. It was so empty, dull, gray, orange slipping away, but something was missing. He leaned over the railing and looked up. A couple of straggler clouds floated overhead, but the sky still felt empty for how vast it was. What? He repeated to himself. Hey, Mum! He turned, heading to the front door. Where's the moon? He burst into the house. His mother looked up from her Kindle. Oh, gee, I don't know, honey, she said as her son stormed into the living room. Well, the goddamn moon's missing. He thrust his pointer finger at the window. Well, the sun's only just setting now, right? His mother did a kind of shrug, juggling her shoulders. She watched her son pace between the coffee table and television. I almost always see it coming up over the cornfield on nights when I'm not working. Maybe the moon's just not coming out tonight, his mother suggested. She watched her son continue to pace. He shook his head, going, I don't know, Mum. Wallace, you had any beers yet? I was just about to when I noticed the goddamn moon's missing. Wallace waved one hand up, brought down with a slap against his thigh, and continued pacing. I always have my beer with the moon, no matter how it feelings. Full, whether it's shaped like that hook thing or not, or like an eye shape on the axis. The moon goes through many shapes, honey, his mother noted while he kept pacing. But it's never been goddamn missing. Wallace, she said in a whisper, you wake up your father. I gotta go find the moon, he said. You sure you don't just want to relax on the porch like usual? His mother asked. I'm sure the moon will be back tomorrow night. If it's missing, it ain't, he snapped. His mother wasn't fazed. She just wanted to read. Just be careful, she said as Wallace stormed back out onto the porch. She knew she'd hear his motorcycle rev up shortly, and she did. She could have rolled her eyes when the sound of the engine spurted awake, but she didn't. Her eyes were busy scanning the text of her Victorian romance novel. She heard her son drive the motorcycle away as the light inside the living room fizzled out, for the sunset was almost over. Wallace bounced on his motorcycle down the road. Its one cyclops headlight sent out a cone of light that disappeared underneath the pale gray sky. It wasn't close to being dark yet, just that pale hour between sunset and night. Wallace knew the moon always showed up for that hour, a loyal date. He looked at the road ahead, between the hedges of corn on either side of the road. He had already checked the sky. He didn't stop to ask Tracy the Scarecrow if she had seen the moon. Tracy had probably never even seen a thing in her scarecrow life. Wallace sped on. The field of corn disappeared and gave way to uncultivated fields, perfect for a lone zombie to walk through. But Wallace didn't have time to stop to talk to zombies and scarecrows. He sped on. The sky had turned to absolute gray when he parked his motorcycle outside of Luna Bud's house, which looked like a run-down shack. Luna Budd would always do Wallace's homework for him in school, and he'd give her part of his lunch in return. She was a skinny girl, but she could eat. Jokes about her possibly being pregnant weren't appropriate, but they made pregnancy a fairy tale while she ate her burgers and spicy chicken patties. Luna's pale skin made her tattoos seem more green than black. She had a tattoo of a serpent, or something, on her bicep. Whatever her tattoos were depended on how long you dared to look at them. Wallace, constantly disinterested, never looked long enough to know. "Looney, your friend's here," her father, Daniel Budd, called while he sat in front of a television that was playing Fox News. He knew it was her friend because her friend was the only one with a motorcycle within a 30-mile radius. Luna Budd came frolicking out of their house, making jumping steps to her friend on the motorcycle. She was ready for small-town gossip, but she wasn't ready for what came out of Wallace's mouth. "The goddamn moon's missing," Wallace blurted out before Luna could ask. She put her hands on her hips and surveyed the sky, which was now a confused indigo. She looked at her friend with an even deeper look of confusion. She had a low bullshit tolerance, but she saw the seriousness on his face. "Really?" Luna croaked. She was amused with herself for some reason. "Yep," Wallace nodded. Even though she wore an olive green tank top and had her arms on full display, he didn't look at her tattoos. Missing moon was more important. Fortunately for Luna, there was always something more important to Wallace Cannon. She smiled up at the sky while crickets chirped. "This ain't no laughing matter, Luna," Wallace insisted. He flipped his hair out of his face. "You gonna help or not?" "You want me to help you look for the moon?" Luna inquired, even though she already knew she was going to. All Wallace did was nod, a nod that flipped his hair out of his face. Again. Luna flipped her hair just 'cause and climbed on the back of Wallace's motorcycle. Her arms made a harness around his waist. He adjusted his arms and back and scooted slightly forward to give her room, and he circled back onto the road. The engine said goodbye to the Bud's splintered and lopsided shack. Luna held on tight as the motorcycle bounced on by telephone poles. The telephone pole wires hummocked from pole to pole like abandoned gondola poles. They did pass a rusting car about 10 feet into the field that could have passed for some gondola that dropped from the telephone wires, but the moon wasn't there. Luna had looked at the abandoned car just as she always did whenever passing it, and Wallace kept his eyes on the open country road. Luna didn't talk, not because the engine was too loud, but because she didn't want to say anything. She only wanted to hold onto her friend tight while she got to have a motorcycle at night. That hour between sunset and night was passing, and the telephone poles and wires became black silhouettes. The grainy concrete flickered by underneath the spread of the motorcycle's flashlight headlights. Both of their hair was being tossed in the current that the ride rocketed into. They neared the town city, and when the bike slowed down, Luna took a chance to speak. "Shouldn't this be a job for the astronauts?" she asked. Wallace didn't answer, because he didn't know. He wasn't the kind of person to say, "I don't know," so Luna didn't ask again. And the question lingered where they took a turn under a set of traffic lights near the town library. The town library's lights were off, and so were the steeples and some of the antique shops. Wallace rode at a pace that wouldn't wake the elderly buildings up. "Who are we looking for here?" Luna chirped, her voice warm in Wallace's ear. "More help?" "If they're up," Wallace grunted underneath the spurting of the bike. "They should be awake, watching TV or something," Luna mused. "Well, should look outside their window and see that the moon's missing," Wallace grunted, turning his head at every building they passed to see if the lights in the windows were on. "Wallace?" Luna's voice stung with a little bit of panic when Wallace rolled the bike into the parking lot of the sheriff's station. "You can't," she urged. The police cruiser was parked and the lights in the station were on. The motorcycle's engine came to a stuttering stop, and the sound of crickets could be heard again. The cones of orange streetlights came down instead of lapis lazuli moonlight. "Who else is there to tell?" Wallace grumbled. He dismounted his motorcycle, looking up while crossing the parking lot. The sky seemed similar to an empty auditorium where only ghosts could sing, one long, wailing feminine note that was felt instead of heard. Wallace. Luna scurried up behind him. She had hesitated before dismounting the bike, but of course she was going to follow him. And she followed him up to the stairs into the white lobby of the police station. Sheriff Lloyd was sitting at the front desk in his tan uniform and his gold badge on his chest. The dispatcher was on maternity leave. The only calls he ever got were injuries related to old age anyway.
"Would you like to report a crime?"
Sheriff Lloyd asked in a Georgian drawl. Wallace faced the sheriff and pointed to the door behind him and Luna. "Yeah," Wallace answered, a little too overcome with agitation. "The moon's missing." Sheriff Lloyd leaned over the table.
"The moon's missing?"
Luna had a terrified look on her face, the kind that a student gets during a group presentation in front of the whole class. But Sheriff Lloyd was just one man, the only one working in the station that night.
"What do you mean the moon's missing?"
the sheriff inquired. He made a slightly spasmodic head movement when he spoke. Perhaps it was his way to emphasize the strangeness of what Wallace had put forth. Wallace just nodded and stood prepared to run back outside to jump on his motorcycle.
"How can the moon go missing?"
Sheriff Lloyd asked. But before Wallace could retort, Luna spoke. "Let's just go look for ourselves," she pleaded with her friend. But the sheriff was already interested in the case. He darted his eyes from Wallace to Luna and back to Wallace.
"Is the moon missing?"
he asked Luna. Her hesitation was all he needed for an answer.
"All right."
He got up from the desk, the taser and gun and magazines clinking on his belt as he did.
"Let's go have a look outside and see if the moon really is missing."
"You aren't going to arrest us?" Luna asked. The sheriff stopped in place.
"No,"
he responded, after studying the stale panic on her face.
"Shouldn't you have been wearing a helmet?"
Sheriff Lloyd asked when the triage entered outside into the parking lot. He had a cowboy gait to him. He walked with a western swagger and spoke with a southern drawl. He looked up, turned in place, surveying the entire darkening sky. It was complete darkness now, and a couple of stars were visible.
"Well, you're right. The moon is, after all, missing."
"You're going to help us look for it?" Wallace asked, almost demandingly. Sheriff Lloyd spun in place, snarling.
"Look for it?"
"Yeah," Wallace nodded. "Look for it." Sheriff Lloyd put his hands on his belt.
"Thank you, but I think I'm going to get back to working dispatch and focus on actual emergencies."
"Hey!" Wallace snapped when the sheriff started back to the station. The sheriff spun around again, standing as if a good old-fashioned shootout was about to take place. His eyes pierced inquisitively while Wallace ranted. "How would you feel if the sun disappeared? Somebody's got to care about the moon. You saw the sky. It ain't there." Sheriff Lloyd looked up again and put his hands on his belt. He sniffled, rubbed his nose, and sounded sorry to speak.
"Yup, it isn't up there. But the moon isn't always out every night."
"It was out last night," Wallace retorted. Sheriff Lloyd didn't pay attention to the cosmos's foliage the way that Wallace did, and he didn't want to admit this, so he looked down and sniffled again. "See?" Wallace continued. "Give me one good reason why you shouldn't come help us look."
"Because it's ridiculous,"
Sheriff Lloyd whined. Luna froze in place. She was just waiting for something sinister to go down, but it didn't. Her eyes bulged while Sheriff Lloyd looked out into the sleeping town.
"Now, how do you expect to find the moon?"
Wallace shrugged. "It's got to be somewhere." "We rode," Luna butted in, looking from her friend to the sheriff. "On his motorcycle. I was looking up while he drove. It's true, I saw no moon." Grim consideration flashed in Sheriff Lloyd's eyes. He had to look down at the concrete because he didn't want the young people to see that maybe, just maybe, he was considering helping them. "So what do you say?" Luna asked, thinking of her friend. "Would you help us?" Sheriff Lloyd swallowed. He took a deep breath through his gritted teeth. Wallace and Luna held their breaths.
All right. Get back on your bike. I got helmets inside if you want.
No, Wallace quickly said, but Luna chirped up. I'd like one. So, after getting Luna a helmet, and after shaking hands with Wallace and getting on a first-name basis, Sheriff Lloyd made sure to display a forgery of reluctance upon getting into his cruiser. But the slightest fascination flickered on his face when he was safely unseen inside the cruiser. He shook his head and chuckled to himself, while the sound of the motorcycle's engine came in muffledly through the cruiser. He looked out the driver's side window and saw Luna strap her helmet on before the bike ricketed away. Sheriff Lloyd buckled up and followed. The sheriff couldn't help but chuckle in disbelief at himself while he trailed the motorcycle out of the town center. The convoy turned onto a classically American desolate highway after passing the old high school. The American flag waved loyally on the flagpole outside. The moon that Neil Armstrong walked on was gone, and it was back to driving past the silhouettes of telephone poles. Sheriff Lloyd looked out the driver's side window a couple of times when the motorcycle ahead of him crawled down to a creeping pace underneath clear skies. And indeed, there were only stars, no moon. And suddenly, such an absence was as bizarre as getting to hear your own organs squeeze and pull on themselves while they worked. They kept on down a road that cut through another desolated field of abandoned farmland, soon to be bought by Bill Gates or China. Sheriff Lloyd wondered what the girl was saying to the boy on the motorcycle. He really couldn't bear to look out the window any further. The stars made him forget that he was just a cop, and made him remember a human being, and, well, that was as bizarre as hearing your own heartbeat.
He really should be wearing a helmet,
Sheriff Lloyd said to himself just to fill the silence in his cruiser. He thought it would distract him from whatever emotions came from the implications of planet Earth being without a moon. What exactly would that be like? Maybe this was it. Maybe he was in the beginnings of it. Eventually, Wallace slowed down when a plump man exited a farmhouse on the side of the road. The man was wearing a neon orange vest over a nylon camouflage shirt. Sheriff Lloyd perked up when he saw that the fat man had a double-barrel shotgun in his hand. He put the cruiser in park in the middle of the road while Wallace conversed with the man, sharing words that the sheriff couldn't discern from inside his cruiser. Sheriff Lloyd exited his car. "I came out 'cause I saw y'all following each other," the plump man shouted to the sheriff. The sheriff calmly moseyed up to the parked motorcycle and the big gutted traffic cone that stood beside it. The man continued, "I came out to see if there's anything I could do. What's going on?" Sheriff Lloyd put his hands on his hips, feeling some premature embarrassment before he got to explaining.
These kids here think the moon's gone missing, and, well, I'm out here to help them find it.
"Name's Otis," the plump man said, holding out his free hand to Sheriff Lloyd. They shook hands. Otis persisted. "How can I help?" It occurred to Sheriff Lloyd that maybe this farming man was just extremely bored and easily excited at the convoy that was bound to pass his house. He had just come out and stopped them mid-search party.
Is that really necessary?
Sheriff Lloyd nodded at the double-barrel shotgun in Otis's sausage fingers. Otis held his mouth open as if to wait for some excuse to fly into it. He looked like an astonished toad. Thankfully for Otis, Sheriff Lloyd abandoned this question and questioned Wallace instead, going,
"You okay if he joins us, Wallace?"
Wallace nodded. Otis seemed excited and waddled over to his pickup truck in the farmhouse driveway, hopped in, shouted, "Lead the way!" and started the engine. Sheriff Lloyd took languid steps back to his cruiser, not even bothering to look at the gray sky anymore. He got back into his cruiser. Wallace and Luna led the convoy on his motorcycle. The police cruiser was in the middle, with Farmer Otis in his beat-down pickup truck in last place. His double-barrel shotgun was on the passenger seat, and in the rear-view mirror, Sheriff Lloyd could discern the sheer attention and alertness in the farmer's face as he drove. Otis was taking this wild goose chase for the moon really seriously, and it made Sheriff Lloyd wonder what he had gotten himself into. Luna was possibly wondering the same thing while she hugged Wallace, but she didn't feel anything wrong about it. About 10 minutes later, the convoy turned down into what could have been considered a neighborhood. The houses were widely dispersed, and not all were inhabited. When nearing one house that had a lady smoking a cigarette on the front porch, Otis flicked his headlights on and off and slowed down. The sheriff did the same, parked to the side of the road as Otis got out of his truck, and Luna spoke into Wallace's ear, "Slow down, we're stopping." Wallace kicked his foot down on the pavement to stop the bike from tipping over when they stopped. He flipped his hair and looked at the lady on the porch, who was now waving to Otis. Now, thankfully, Wallace and Luna did not know who this woman was. She had curly brown hair, close to gray, wrinkles, and reading glasses. This woman was the town whore. Her name was Jeannie Sideburn. She didn't have sideburns, but her curly hair sprouted out menacingly from her head. Maybe it was attractive in the 70s when she was a lifeguard at the public pool, and Otis was a little kid learning how to swim. "Hi, Otis," the woman shouted with a voice somewhere in between Heavy Smoker and Olivia Newton-John singing. "What'd I do now?" she shouted, referring to the presence of the sheriff. Sheriff Lloyd stayed in his car while Otis waddled up to the porch. It can be surmised that he told her why there was this misfit parade out and about, because soon after they spoke, Jeannie was locking up her house, finishing her cigarette with hasty drags, and getting into Otis's pickup truck. She moved the shotgun to the back seat, nearly hitting Otis over the head while doing so, and the search party carried on. The sheriff kept his eye on the digital clock in his cruiser while following Wallace and Luna. The way both Wallace's and Luna's hair moved like strings and ribbons in the wind had a foreboding to it, like they were driving straight into a constant scream, and all that breath was pushing back their hair. Then Sheriff Lloyd looked in his rearview mirror and saw that Jeannie was laughing and leaning over to Otis while he drove. It was easy for the sheriff to look away and watch the road again. The sheriff wondered on. Weren't there stars enough? Can't this kid go one night without the moon? How much did the moon mean to him anyway? He got lost in the road, the film reel of the road, the monotonous, the tiring, soothing road. He drove with one hand and rubbed his temple with the other, while the yellow line to the left stayed stagnant on the left. He occasionally looked out into the fields of abandoned farmland, tricking himself into believing he'd see the moon rising, but all he saw was the empty American dream. He looked back at the boy and the girl in front of him, riding on a motorcycle. Wallace was without a helmet. Stupid, but what can you expect from a young kid? And with a deep breath, his wonders ossified. He fixed his face into a sure and serious expression. He was going to help them find the moon. They got into an area where logs and marshes started appearing, but the marshes appeared just as the abandoned farmland. The only thing that was different was the smell. The air was muggier. The crickets were better tuned and didn't sound so thirsty. Lonely oaks in the distance started appearing here and there, but they still stood like forgotten scarecrows. If the moon is hiding anywhere, it's got to be around here, the sheriff thought to himself. 20 minutes of the same sky later, Wallace led the group into the start of a woods. The road was untreated. Their wheels made alarming bumps every now and then. The branches reached out to try and swipe Luna off the back of the motorcycle, and still Jeannie and Otis were talking in his truck. They drove further, and the woods only became denser. Sheriff Lloyd had spent so long on the road that he had become enthralled in the search. So he felt agitated that they were driving inside of a wood, instead of driving through open farmland where the night sky was visible. He cringed behind the wheel, wanting to honk the horn, but he remembered he was driving a police cruiser, and considered being somewhat professional. But what were they doing in the woods? What would the moon be doing hiding in the woods? It wouldn't be able to... Wallace stopped, kicking his foot out to stop the bike from falling over. Luna unclipped the strap of her helmet, got off and stretched, and the cruiser and the pickup truck stopped in succession. There were no crickets to be heard inside the dehydrated wood when Sheriff Lloyd stepped onto the road into the outskirts of headlights. He approached Wallace, who was approaching him.
"What are we doing in the woods?"
Sheriff Lloyd asked before coming to a stop. "I say it's time we split up," Wallace nodded. Sheriff Lloyd stepped back, repeating,
"Split up?"
The sheriff observed the seriousness on Wallace's face, and stepped forward again, saying,
"In the woods?"
Wallace nodded.
"What's the moon gonna be doing hiding in the woods?"
Sheriff Lloyd asked, sounding offended. "Well, it's not in the sky," Wallace said matter-of-factly. He was right, and Sheriff Lloyd wanted to step up to him and get in his face, but he was right. Sheriff Lloyd tried composing himself, but he still sounded agitated when he spoke.
"I know, but what's the moon gonna be doing hiding in the woods?"
Wallace didn't say anything. Sheriff Lloyd started walking back down the road. Otis got out of his truck. "What's going on? Do I need my shotgun?"
"No, Otis."
Sheriff Lloyd put his hand up and continued walking. "Where are you going?" Otis asked. Sheriff Lloyd crouched down where he was, a couple yards away, behind the parked convoy.
"I just need to think,"
he said, looking down at the puzzle piece that was the long stretch of road. He wondered if this was stupid of him to have done. It was. Was it? He went to shake his head, but was conflicted even whether to shake his head or not. Jeannie got out of the truck with a fresh cigarette in her mouth. She lit it up, asking in a muffled voice, "Why'd we stop?" "The sheriff's thinking," Otis answered her. The sheriff twisted up, shouting slightly,
"Wallace wants to split up, scan the woods. I don't think that's such a good idea."
Wallace stood in the road like a disgraced presidential candidate who didn't care. He really didn't care because he was going to run into the woods anyway. He was at least honorable enough to consult the search party first.
"I say,"
the sheriff shrugged, remembering that he should be the most responsible and reasonable one there.
"we vote."
There was an agreeing silence that overcame everyone. Everybody besides Jeannie seemed transfixed. She was focused on her cigarette. "I'll split up if everyone else wants to," Otis boomed. Wallace nodded. Sheriff Lloyd shrugged. Luna stayed beside the motorcycle, holding her helmet like it was a teddy bear. Her tattoo seemed pagan among the twisting trees on both sides of the road. She stood, face like a witch who didn't want to be a witch. The silence continued.
"Okay, we split up, but don't get lost. I'll go into the roads one side, Otis and Jeannie go on the other. You two, Wallace and Lucy."
"It's Luna," Luna shouted. The sheriff went on, pointing forward.
"Wallace and Luna, you two walk the road and just keep an eye out."
He waited for a moment, but heard no protest. He took a couple of steps back, fluctuating between belief and disbelief.
"All right, holler if you find anything."
"Ah," Jeannie cackled. "We ain't gonna find no damn moon in the sticks." "Jeannie," Otis scolded. Otis was childish with belief, and gung-ho with excitement. He reached into the back seat of his truck and got out his shotgun. The convoy split up in 3 separate directions, with Sheriff Lloyd going into the woods left of the road, Otis and Jeannie going into the woods right of the road, and Wallace and Luna walking straight ahead. The sheriff crept through the same terrain as Jeannie and Otis did, Jeannie sucking on her cigarette and Otis hugging his gun. Luna and Wallace walked down the road between an invasion of crooked branches, walking just like they used to down the high school hallways. Wallace walked with the dread of knowing he was going to fail math. Luna walked with the pep of just getting to be a girl. "Do you think we'll find the moon?" she asked, just wanting to make conversation. "We have to," Wallace said, the weight of the search really taking an effect on his voice. His statement, "we have to," made the surrounding woods flex with hunger. Wood crackled in the distance as the forest groaned in report, but it was so faint in nature that neither one noticed it. They walked further down the road. The forest canopy blocked out so much starlight that Luna took out her phone and brought up its flashlight, scanning the road and switching from side to side to see if the moon was hiding behind the trees. She swayed the flashlight unprofessionally and a bit too fast, but Wallace didn't mind. They walked on. Wallace took an audible deep breath that made Luna unmask her ditzy delight. She looked at him even though all she saw was his mop of hair. "We're going to find the moon, Wallace," she assured him, but he didn't respond. They walked on. About 10 minutes later, when a spell of tiredness was beginning to creep in and turn them into zombies, Wallace and Luna noticed something in the distance of the woods on the right side of the road. "Wallace, look!" Luna shrieked, pointing into the woods where a pale and yellow glowing lingered. It was a ways away, whatever it was, but it glowed with a steadfast and constant vigor. It was just a glow obscured by the distance, but its pale and yellow color was undeniable. Wallace and Luna stopped, the soles of their shoes skidding to a scratchy stop on the concrete. His mouth sagged while looking into the obscurity of twisting, skinny trees. The trees got skinnier in the distance, and all of them crowded together around the glow. "Do you think it's really it?" Luna asked. She sounded frightened, and her phone flashlight was too bright and white compared to the glowing in the distance. "I don't know," Wallace managed to say. They stepped into the woods on the right side of the road, their shoes audibly crunching down on dead brush. "You did it, Wallace," Luna cheered. "You found it. You found it, I think." Wallace didn't say anything. Luna followed him through the winding columns of trees. Wallace didn't know how to speed walk. He trafficked with something between jogging and limping while they rushed to the glowing in the woods. "Do you think it's injured?" he asked amongst the sound of snapping sticks. Luna hopscotched behind him. "I hope not," she mused. "Do you think maybe it fell? Maybe it hit a comet or something?" Wallace stammered. Maybe it's just tired," Luna suggested. They hurried on, the trees passing like demented cartoon faces in the darkness. Vague warnings were in the holes of some of the old crooked oak trees. The glow got closer. "Come on," Wallace grunted, sounding like he had a fresh new voice as he broke into a run. Luna ran after him. The pale and yellow light started washing onto their faces. They squinted when they skidded into the realm of the glow. The trees were fewer there, where the yellow glow lingered on the gray ground. "Wallace," Luna muttered. Their eyes adjusted. The glowing smelled like exhaust fumes. Wallace crept out of the glow with his hand up to block out the blinding light. He sidestepped and found a white Mustang caked in rust with its headlights on. "Wallace," Luna muttered again as she stood in the yellow headlights. "Whose car is this?" Wallace paced in front of the driver's side door. "Wallace." Luna said his name with a kind of sympathetic urgency, but it was no use. Her friend punched his fist into the door, waking up the man inside. "Oh!" A voice came into the night. There came some rustling from inside the Mustang, before the engine turned off and the yellow glow retreated into the lens of the headlights. For a brief moment, Wallace and Luna had to let their eyes readjust to the darkness again. "I left the car on," said the voice from inside the Mustang. "Who are you guys? Did my wife send you here?" "We're looking for the moon," Wallace griped, still pacing. There was a tense silence while he paced. The voice from inside the Mustang came again. "Looking for the moon?" Luna explained from where she stood, while her friend still paced like a Little League baseball coach whose team was playing horribly. and Luna asked what he was doing out here in the woods with his car, with the lights on, and the man explained. "I'm Donnie O'Leal," said the voice from inside the Mustang. I just came out here to get some sleep." His voice shrunk. "My wife's mad at me." "Mad at you?" Luna squeaked. Wallace was still pacing. In the darkness, Luna could tell that this Donnie O'Leal character was watching Wallace pace outside the driver's side window. Luna crept up to the Mustang and flashed her phone flashlight into the driver's seat. The man had gray slick-back hair and stubble, and a sad and sorry, handsome-looking face, like he'd been kicked out of a biker gang and regretted it. He winced when she did this. "Sorry," she said, putting the flashlight down. "I just wanted to see what you look like." "Jesus, kid. Am I as pretty as you expected?" Donnie complained. He squinted as if that would get the remnants of the flash out of his eyes. "Feel like I just got flashbanged." "So, you were sleeping in your car?" Luna spoke the question like an apology. Donnie sounded sorry too. "Yeah, must have fell asleep with the engine running." "Why's your wife mad at you?" Luna asked while her friend still paced. "I left the toilet seat up too many times," Donnie said in one long exhale. Luna would have laughed had it not been for how worried she was for Wallace. "I'm sure it's somewhere, Wallace. We'll find out," Luna begged. Donnie looked from Wallace to Luna, switching his tired eyes between them. His mouth was ajar, and it made him look stupid. He looked like he could use a shave and a cup of coffee, and Wallace looked like he could use some moonlight. "Say, do you guys want some help?" Donnie spoke up. Luna's face became alert with surprise. Wallace stopped pacing and examined the man inside the Mustang. Donnie shrugged and contorted his lips into a fishy frown. "But don't you need some sleep?" Luna inquired. Her voice was sweet. Donnie shrugged again. "Sure." Wallace nodded at Donnie. "So," Donnie's face beamed with sadistic charm that made Luna feel uneasy. "What's the game plan?" "We have others helping us look," Wallace said, swaggering in another pace. "We split up when we came into the woods." "Oh, so this is like a whole thing." Donnie's smirk wavered. He looked at Luna and Wallace as if to examine them a final time before saying, "Hop on in, it's unlocked." Wallace got in the front passenger seat and Luna got in the back. She had to scoot past an empty cardboard box that used to be a six-pack. Never mind that," Donnie said over his shoulder. It was sobering to see the yellow headlights light up the woods ahead. Donnie reversed and turned the Mustang around, sending the stiff cones of headlights across the trees, like a farmer swings a scythe, and he drove down a bumpy road that led back onto the main one. It took some time, but Wallace navigated Donnie to where the convoy had parked. Wallace and Luna got out to wait around his bike, leaving Donnie perplexed behind the wheel of his Mustang. Donnie was a little worried to see the cop car, but nothing was as scary as his wife. While Donnie, Wallace, and Luna waited, Sheriff Lloyd was taking big steps through the woods with his flashlight in hand. He took big steps to avoid ditches, rotten logs, and patches of plants that he feared might have been poison ivy. He began to expect to see a Cheshire cat smiling in the branches up, but the Cheshire cat was fat, and these branches were far too gaunt and skinny to be holding any feline from Wonderland. For some reason, his flashlight made the surrounding forest only seem blacker. On the other side of the woods, Jeannie was complaining while chewing on her cigarette. She followed Otis, who tiptoed ahead, hugging his shotgun like a run-in with Bigfoot was inevitable. "Why are we looking for the moon anyways?" Jeannie spat. "Ain't there already a moon? There's one moon. It'll be back some other night. Tomorrow." She sucked on her cigarette. She started talking about local bars, which ones she liked and which ones she didn't. Otis didn't respond much, for the woods were getting to him. "Say, I never shot one of those," Jeannie croaked, her raspy voice really fitting in with the woods that seemed to be wearing a layering of tar. "I have a Glock at home, but I heard those aren't the ones the guys down at the bar shoot. Do you have pistols?" "A few." Otis answered quietly. He was focused on the skeleton trees. He was focused on where the moon might be hiding. "Want to teach me how to shoot sometime, big boy?" Jeannie blurted. Maybe an owl or crow flew away at this. "You hunt deer wearing that?" Jeannie asked. Meanwhile, Sheriff Lloyd was ready to head back to the main road. He shone his flashlight down on weirdly shaped logs. Some rotting logs had the aspect of faces in an abstract painting. He didn't like the lucidity of some of them. None of the trees were going to tell him where the moon went, for nature does not obey the police. So, Sheriff Lloyd walked back to the main road, going the direction from which he came with his flashlight swinging subtly back and forth. He realized something on the walk back, though. This was the most unique night he had had since being 10 years on the force. He wasn't tired. He was something like tired, but this was different. It was around 10:30 when the convoy reunited. Wallace and Luna introduced Donnie to the search party. Sheriff Lloyd gave Donnie an approving nod, while Jeannie did a kind of weird bow towards him. Otis just fumbled about in the street like a confused warthog. So now, Wallace and Luna, on the motorcycle, led the convoy out of the woods. It went Wallace and Luna on the bike, Lloyd in the cruiser, Jeannie and Otis in the Otis's truck, and Donnie Allele in last place. About 10 minutes later, they were out on the open road again. The trees lessened and abandoned farmland sprung up again. The land became more hilly. It was interesting how the motorcycle climbed. All that could be heard was the sound of cars going down the road and the sound of Wallace's motorcycle. Donnie Allele lagged along behind the pickup truck. Now, I don't know if you've ever gone to sleep after 6 consecutive beers, but you might wake up a couple hours after falling asleep with a kind of early hangover, a kind of sleepy doom that sleep cannot cure, and sleep will not come. This was the moodiness that Donnie Allele was in. He had a groggy way about him, and he only drove straight because he was so tired that his hand didn't waver on the wheel. Not to mention, but the dread of an angry wife rode with him in the back seat. Luckily for Donnie Allele, the search party was riding at a slow pace. Wallace kept his eyes on the road while Luna looked up into the moonless sky. There was a kind of telepathy between them. He didn't have to ask her to check the sky. She was doing it anyway. He didn't have to look over his shoulder to see her looking up. He felt her doing so anyway. Otis was getting a little tired of smelling cigarette smoke and old candy breath. Jeannie never shut up. Sheriff Lloyd made himself not look at the digital clock inside the cruiser. It was getting close to 11. He looked in the rearview mirror and saw Jeannie talking to Otis. She was cackling and holding a cigarette between her fingers, and he wondered about the stranger in the Mustang. They stopped and checked an abandoned church, though Sheriff Lloyd advised against it on account of how hazardous the place looked. Some of the stained glass windows were smashed in, and the pews were upended and splintery. Otis knelt and made the sign of the cross on his body when entering, and Jeannie examined the atrium as if she had never been in any taller building. Donnie stood behind the sheriff, not wanting to tell anyone that this was the church he and his wife had got married in 23 years ago. Having some knowledge of the church, Donnie climbed to the second-story balcony in the back, taking a staircase near the confessional booth. Sheriff Lloyd squinted at the confessional, perhaps overcome with the sudden feeling that he had been a priest in a past life. Donnie observed the organ on the door balcony while Jeannie's whisper echoed in the church. "What's that smell?" "It's you," Sheriff Lloyd wanted to respond. The pipes of the organ were more rusted than the muffler on Donnie's Mustang. Then he looked out of a circular window. No moon. Wallace and Luna walked over brown glass bottles towards the altar. There was a dead vulture behind it, and that was when the rancid wet chicken smell hit them. Wallace and Luna retreated, hurrying everyone else out of the church before the miasma could reach them. Wallace and Luna bent down outside of the church and coughed the smell out of their lungs. They could taste the skunky sulfur smell. Donnie was the last one to exit, doing so slowly and taking a sweet time. When they finished coughing, it appeared they had discovered why the church was abandoned. A dead vulture had gassed the parishioners out. For some reason, Wallace and Sheriff Lloyd were like joint leaders of the search party, and everyone looked to them, expecting them to talk and plan out the next move. The next move was to keep driving ahead. They had spent long enough out on the open road, in the woods, and recently in a stinking church, to go home. Now, nobody wanted to admit it, but part of why they refused to go home was that it was too much fun. Donnie was tired. Otis was getting tired of Jeannie. Sheriff Lloyd still had his lawful conscience screaming at him and asking him what he was doing. Luna was biting her tongue and telling Wallace they weren't going to find the moon, but nobody wanted to desert the expedition. So they drove away from the church, driving down a road that cut through abandoned farmland. The brush of the farmland decreased in height. It was by chance that Wallace saw the distant silhouette of a coyote. It was stocky and trotting against the gray and purple backdrop of a Milky Way painted sky. "Luna," Wallace grumbled over the sound of the engine. "Don't coyotes howl at the moon?" "I think that's wolves," Luna shouted back. Wallace slowed down and stopped, kicking his foot down. The convoy stopped behind him. He kept an eye on the coyote's lonely silhouette while everyone got out of their cars, unaware and talking. "Shh," he hushed them. "Turn off y'all's engines," he demanded in a sharp whisper. Everyone leaned into the cars, doing so and coming back out to listen to the silence that Wallace had so desperately sought to listen to. He put his hand up to keep everyone quiet, and he looked out, waiting for the coyote to say something. He moved his eyes with the coyote. It trotted off alone, and Wallace wondered. No, Wallace knew that the coyote was looking for the moon, too. He lowered down his hand in a kind of disappointment. Sheriff Lloyd moseyed up to Wallace to see what he was looking at. He squinted into the distance, seeing the coyote, too.
"Any significance to your dog?"
Sheriff Lloyd whispered. Wallace knew this was some kind of sarcastic remark, but he didn't respond directly. All that Wallace did was nod in the direction of the coyote and whisper back, "He's looking for the moon, too." Sheriff Lloyd looked also. The two watched the silhouette of the lanky thing wander. They didn't know it, but both of them had silently wondered to themselves if it had come from the woods. Wallace cupped his hands to his mouth and howled. His voice traveled up into the open night. The coyote stopped in place and its head disappeared in its silhouette. The search party was taken aback for a few seconds before, to everybody's dismay, Sheriff Lloyd belted out one great, big, long howl. He threw his voice into the night, christening the moonless sky. It was so powerful that it carried on into the sky. The sheriff had leaned back farther than Wallace had, and he had even closed his eyes. It made everybody flinch, but then, in the wake of the startling, there was some sense of wonder. Nobody was sure if it was Sheriff Lloyd's echo carrying out into the field, or if it was the coyote's solemn response. Either way, it cemented the sorrow of the missing moon, and made everybody a little sad that the moon wasn't there. But why did they care? Why did the most reasonable of any of them succumb to howling? Sheriff Lloyd gave Wallace a half-smile while recovering from his howl. "I never heard a cop howl," Wallace grunted, trying not to smile. But this made Sheriff Lloyd's half-smile become weaker. Why didn't he like being reminded of what he was? When the howl finally galloped away, Jeannie applauded. "Whoa!" she cried. "Good job, officer!" It was a shame that Wallace watched the coyote silhouette instead of watching the smile reinvigorate on the sheriff's face, especially because Sheriff Lloyd was smiling at Wallace when it rejuvenated. But the coyote held Wallace's attention. "Wallace?" Luna beckoned in a voice she used to use in the cafeteria in the hallway. "What?" Wallace turned around. "What is it?" Luna asked, to which Sheriff Lloyd answered with a bit of veiled excitement.
"It's a dog. Way out there, you see? It's a coyote or dog or something."
"Oh, I see it," Luna chirped, but she didn't sound impressed. She had seen more coyote silhouettes than the sheriff, even though she was younger.
"We got his attention, though,"
Sheriff Lloyd exclaimed. It sounded like he was about to howl again. "We're just silhouettes to him, too," Luna pointed out.
"Wallace says he's looking for the moon, too,"
Sheriff Lloyd said, managing to sound like the same cop who told Luna and Wallace that they should have been wearing a helmet. "Well, gee, maybe he is." Jeannie shrugged flamboyantly. "Is this a clue or something?" Donnie asked with a nod. Nobody responded, and that was the only answer he needed to know. "Yes," Wallace grunted with a kind of determination. "It's a clue. We're close to the moon, I reckon." The sound of Otis adjusting his shotgun in his hands was audible, but Donnie's heavy expression of exhaustion was not visible in the gray aura upon the open road.
"I'm not one to bother a coyote or wolf or something,"
Sheriff Lloyd thought aloud, grabbing onto his belt.
"but I say we follow him."
"And what?" Jeannie cracked. "Drive onto unattended farmland?"
"Well, it's looking like the only clue we've gotten so far."
Sheriff Lloyd cocked his head. Nobody objected. Wallace sounded off. "He's right." He turned to face the convoy, continuing, "I say we do it." "But aren't we going to scare him?" Luna asked in a pleading tone. Wallace answered with an uncertain but uncaring shrug. "That's a risk we have to take." He could see the look she gave him even in the opaqueness of nighttime. Luna gave him the same old look she'd give him when he got a math question wrong, for the 7th time. Sheriff Lloyd broke up the playground nostalgia, speaking up.
"He's trotting off again. If we're gonna decide, we're gonna have to decide soon and now."
"Hell, I say we follow the damn thing," Donnie croaked. "I'm in," Jeannie cracked. "Otis?" "I'll do whatever the team decides on," Otis spoke, making his voice sound deeper than it actually was.
"Well, Otis, you're part of the team, so your opinion matters too,"
Sheriff Lloyd explained. "Yes." Otis didn't hesitate. "Everyone get back in your cars," Wallace ordered while swaggering back to his bike. "Luna, you keep an eye on the sky. I'm gonna follow this coyote." "Okay," Luna whined, bouncing haughtily behind him. "But we're gonna scare him." Wallace led the convoy out into the cemetery of farmland. Straw cracked underneath tires. The coyote started running, and Wallace and the convoy followed it, driving at a pace fair enough for the coyote. "Don't exhaust it," Luna begged above the sound of the engine and the sound of a Mustang, cruiser, and truck tanking over cornfield corpses. "Don't tire him out," she begged. But Wallace only focused on the coyote. It galloped on until it led them back to the woods, where they let it dig away into the trees. The lunar search party rolled back onto the road, drove on, past the abandoned church, having wasted 10 minutes chasing a coyote and circling back to where they were. A little after they passed, they were where they were when they had seen the coyote's silhouette. Donnie had to stop to pee. Jeannie took a much-needed cigarette break, and secretly watched Donnie peeing on the side of the road before he got back in his car. Sheriff Lloyd watched the whole thing unfold in his rearview mirror and figured he'd let it slide. It was around 12:40 in the morning when Sheriff Lloyd started feeling really tired. Driving past farmland without cattle or anything out there felt like driving through an infinite amount of failed New Year's resolutions. So promising, so empty, so unused, so done. But the sky was still gray and moonless, so he didn't flick his headlights on and off or put his brake lights on. Nonetheless, the cruiser was becoming fogged up with the amount of deep breaths he was taking. The search got so monotonous and boring that Jeannie began scanning through the radio stations in Otis's truck. They got talking about music, and Otis said he liked the Foo Fighters and Johnny Cash, and Jeannie said she liked Motley Crue. Of course, Sheriff Lloyd got a little paranoid what their conversation was about when he looked into his rearview mirror. "Motley Crue," Otis spoke from his jowls. "They have some good ones." "Yeah, I like Aerosmith, too," Jeannie said. "I don't like none of this rap stuff the kids listen to nowadays." "Oh, yeah, me neither," Otis jabbered. At 1 in the morning, they were creeping into the outskirts of a different town. It was a little less boondocky now because they were driving under street lamps that were being dipped in an eternal ballroom dance with the telephone poles. It would be harder to see the moon, or any remnants of the moon, underneath the cones of orange light. Sheriff Lloyd flashed his headlights on and off, and they stopped. Wallace and Sheriff Lloyd talked while the others waited, and it was decided on to keep going but avoid other towns. The town they were encroaching on was more densely populated than their own, and Sheriff Lloyd saw no reason for moonlight to be lingering anywhere there. Otis brought out a pair of binoculars, and he, Wallace, and Sheriff Lloyd took turns looking through them at the distant beginnings of a more modernized town. "There's nothing," Wallace grunted, handing Sheriff Lloyd the binoculars. He looked through them and formed a frown beneath them before giving them back to Otis. They drove on, passing a gas station, but its lights were off. They passed a couple of houses and a grocery store. Every building's lights were off. At 3:30 or so, they circled back into the town center, minion traffic lights working for the ghosts who promenaded. They pulled into the police station parking lot. Everyone got out of their cars and congregated inside the lobby where the front desk was. Lots of stretches and yawns played out while Sheriff Lloyd moved over behind the desk to see that there were no missed calls. He checked, even though he hadn't gotten anything on the radio. "Nobody called?" Wallace asked.
"No, nobody,"
Sheriff Lloyd answered. The two of them shared a silence of being perplexed. Both of them thought to themselves that surely somebody would have called the cops about the moon going missing. The lobby felt so sterile and clean. Jeannie and Otis stood with a kind of obliviousness to them, as if they were abducted and standing in an alien ship. Donnie plopped down on a chair like a patient in a waiting room. "What do we do now?" Luna asked. Everyone was looking at Sheriff Lloyd now while he stared down at the phone. There was an intense consideration taking place in his eyes. His hand shot down, tapped out some numbers, and brought the phone up to his ear.
"Hello, this is Sheriff Lloyd, sending out a broadcast alert to all neighboring towns and cities."
His eyes darted around the room, studying everybody's on-edge expressions while he spoke. He gave out the name of the time under his jurisdiction, read off certain details at auctioneer speed.
"The moon is missing. I repeat, all nearby agencies be alert that the moon is missing."
He hung up the phone. There was a silence in the lobby that followed, while everyone looked at the sheriff in a kind of loyalty and disbelief.
"All right."
Sheriff Lloyd hovered his hand above the phone. Part of him wondered if he'd had dreamt he'd done what he just did, said what he said, and it kept his hand in a state of sleep paralysis above the phone.
"All right. So other stations know now."
"They know?" Jeannie croaked. Wallace broke into another pace. He swung his hand up in a typical Wallace spasm, saying, "Of course they know. They ought to see the sky." "Wouldn't they call here first if they saw so?" Jeannie inquired. Sheriff Lloyd had finally brought his hand to his side. Now he seemed ready to shoot the phone. "They probably scared of sounding kooky," Otis suggested.
"He's right. I mean, I thought you two were crazy when you came to me."
Wallace stopped pacing and saw the sheriff looking down at the phone. There was a new direness in the sheriff's expression. "What are we going to do? Just stay here and wait for Johnny to call us to see if we want to go to the prom with him?" Wallace snapped.
Just give it a minute.
Sheriff Lloyd insisted. Everything went quiet. The world was really a lot more quiet when the moon was missing. Donnie held in a burp that turned into him clearing his throat when a dozen or so seconds had passed. The sound of Luna taking a sharp, deep breath in through her nose followed, and Wallace was antsy to get back to pacing. The sheriff blinked. Wallace spoke, but he sounded sorry. "I don't think they're calling, Sheriff."
Okay.
Sheriff Lloyd nodded while still eyeing the phone. It was similar to looking down at a tombstone then. Its dial numbers were such a fabricated date of birth and death. But it was not the moon's tombstone. He wouldn't let it be.
Everyone back outside,
Sheriff Lloyd ordered as kindly as he could. "For what?" Jeannie asked. Sheriff Lloyd was already at the lobby doors when he turned around, answering.
To look again.
Everybody was looking at the sheriff then, so nobody saw Wallace accidentally smile. Sheriff Lloyd pretended that he didn't see such before going outside and hobbling back to his cruiser. Everyone followed him out with a pep in their step, even though they were getting tired. "Hey, Sheriff!" Wallace pulled Sheriff Lloyd aside before he could get back into his cruiser. Wallace went on. "You lead the way this time." Sheriff Lloyd almost smiled. "I'll be right behind you," Wallace promised before heading to his bike, where Luna was strapping on her helmet. Jeannie didn't light another cigarette. She just got in the truck with Otis, while Donnie walked like an old man who had just escaped the nursing home, full of a familiar but new vigor for life. Sheriff Lloyd led the convoy out of the parking lot. This time it was Sheriff Lloyd leading, Wallace and Luna behind him, Otis and Jeannie behind them, and Donnie O'Leal in last place. They never left the town center. Wallace pulled up and matched the speed of the cruiser. Sheriff Lloyd rolled down his window. "I think we should break into the school or library," Wallace spoke above the sound of the cars and his bike.
You what?
"We still have time," Wallace said. "I think we ought to check the gym inside the school. The moon could fit in there."
The moon could not.
Sheriff Lloyd shook his head but stopped talking, maybe out of disbelief. It was getting hard to talk and drive, focusing on the road and the motorcycle beside him. "Don't do it, Wallace!" Luna shouted over the sound of the bike, the wind stealing her voice. "I've done it before," Wallace grunted.
I could have you arrested for that, you know.
Sheriff Lloyd griped, but Wallace didn't seem to care. So it was with reluctance that Sheriff Lloyd led the convoy to the old high school in the town center. "I thought you said you'd never come back to this place," Luna said while unstrapping her helmet in the high school parking lot. Wallace straddled off of the bike. He kept his eyes on the high school as if it was a haunted house. "This is different," he said. "No smoking in school," Jeannie cackled to herself in the background. The convoy followed Wallace and Sheriff Lloyd to the front doors. Wallace got down on his knees and started picking the lock with a hair clip that Luna handed to him. The sheriff asked if they had done this before, but Luna looked at him guiltily while Wallace didn't answer. Sheriff Lloyd shook his head, put his hands on his hips, and surveyed the empty sky above the parking lot, amongst the sound of clicking and scratching that the mice inside the school were being alerted to. The doors creaked open. The party entered into the dark lobby. A trophy case sat adjacent to educational posters which included "Got Milk," "Say No to Drugs," and a bunch of happy-go-lucky things that gave Wallace the heebie-jeebies.
Everybody back in the parking lot at 4:40.
Sheriff Lloyd said. Luna checked her phone, giving Wallace a look at the time. Everyone else took out their phones and checked as well. "That doesn't give us enough time," Wallace said in a kind of growl. "It's only 4:10.
I know, but the school usually opens at 5:30 to the janitors. I'm trying to cover up our tracks. We don't want to be caught doing this.
"I think we should check some of the science classrooms for telescopes and whatnot," Donnie spoke, to which Otis sounded too excited to respond. "We could always use some mascopes, but I got them back at home."
Okay?
Sheriff Lloyd said, pointing at the group.
Jeannie, Otis, and Donnie, you guys check the science classes. Luna, Wallace, and I will run into the gym.
I don't know my way around here. I never passed the 8th grade, Otis clamored. I do. Donnie sounded sorry to say so. Just follow me. Sheriff Lloyd started running down the hallway with Luna and Wallace struggling to keep up with him, while Donnie moved on with Jeannie and Otis behind him. Gray light came in through the windows in the hallway, warning the trio that morning was getting ready for work. Their footsteps echoed down the hall with the occasional squeak. Wallace felt he was running in a dream, back at school. Donnie led Otis and Jeannie onto the 2nd floor of the school and down a hallway of lockers in the west wing. There was a sinister similarity between the rows of lockers and the row of cells in a prison. This gnawed at their subconscious minds. Here's the science classroom I was thinking of, Donnie spoke solemnly upon coming to a stop in front of a classroom door that read, Mrs. O'Leal. He turned halfway around to give Jeannie and Otis a kind of sinister, sarcastic, but ever so sorry grin. He opened up the door and stepped in. Jeannie and Otis followed. There was a replica skeleton strung up in front of the whiteboard that had all kinds of dates and whatnot sprawled across it in a black marker. The gray breath of night and orange streetlights came in through the windows, as weak as corpses crawling out of a crypt, like students crawling back to their desks. Indeed, the desks were all empty, and it made the classroom similar to a crypt. It made the trio tired. Geez, I don't want to feel 15 again, Jeannie shivered. Otis stood beside her with his mouth ajar. Do you know where the scopes are? Are they in here? Otis asked, but it didn't appear that Donnie was looking for a telescope. I met my wife in this classroom. This very classroom, Donnie explained with a smile coming and going. In the 10th grade. He paused and then continued. Now she's a teacher. This is her classroom. She'll probably smell my boots when she gets in here later this morning. Your wife? Jeannie croaked. Donnie nodded, looking around the classroom. He pointed to some of the posters. I helped her put these up at the end of summer. Her and I would pass notes in chemistry. I almost failed. She was top of the class. She got me through high school, you know. Jeannie gave a pleased smile, while Otis kept his mouth ajar in wonder. Donnie went to the back of the class and dug a telescope out of a cabinet. He carried it over to Jeannie and Otis like a doctor handling a baby in a blanket to its mother and father. They started wandering out of the classroom while Donnie stayed in place. A sweet but stupid thought came into his mind. When Jeannie and Otis were back outside in the hall of lockers again, Donnie shuffled over to the whiteboard, picked up a marker, and took off the cap. It ain't here. Wallace's voice echoed out into the ceiling of the gymnasium. All three craned their necks to the tall ceiling. A volleyball net slouched across the gym, while basketball nets hung about like gargoyles. Wallace, the moon can't fit inside the gym, Luna cooed. Sheriff Lloyd looked at every corner of the ceiling. He was perplexed. Why did he expect to find it in there? Here, Luna chimed, picking up a volleyball and offering it to Wallace. Here's the moon, she said in another sympathetic coo. Wallace took it. There were no craters, and it didn't glow, but it was white and it was spherical. He smoothed his hand over the volleyball, examining it in his hands. Bet you never thought you could hold the moon before. Luna's coo became something merrier. She liked seeing how the volleyball gave Wallace a perplexed but amazed look about him.
It's 4:24,
Sheriff Lloyd said to the ceiling. Wallace didn't ignore him on purpose. He was just caught by the volleyball in his hands. Luna realized she might have solved the whole situation right then and there, but there was now a whole search party of people that needed to find the moon. Suddenly, the exhaustion came in a euphoric calling to sleep for her, and she yawned. It made Sheriff Lloyd yawn too. Wallace didn't yawn. He just held the moon in his hands.
Guys, I don't think the moon is here. It's probably better if we get out of here earlier than later.
I agree, Luna chirped. Yeah, sure, Wallace said, nodding and looking away from the volleyball. This time they walked, not ran, down the hallway. Wallace carried the volleyball with him. The search party met outside in the parking lot at 4:33. Donnie, Otis, and Jeannie came out a little later than the others. They got back into their cars. Luna held onto the volleyball while also holding on to Wallace while he drove the bike. The sheriff brought his cruiser to a creeping stop before he could lead the convoy around a corner and over to the station. The convoy stopped behind him. 2 cop cars from different towns were parked outside of the station. Nobody was inside the cars, so it could be assumed that they were inside the station. Sheriff Lloyd crept the cruiser into an intersection and made a U-turn. The convoy followed suit, with Donnie making a 3-point turn and having to speed up to meet the convoy as it drove away. They had all seen the cop cars, and knew that's why the sheriff led the convoy away. They knew it wasn't because he doubted the moon had really disappeared, but because he had doubted other cops. Otis turned on the radio while Jeannie examined the telescope they had taken from Mrs. O'Leal's science class. Yodeling Ghost by Patsy Montana was on, and it was quite the song to creep along to. Sheriff Lloyd led the convoy back out of town, into the outskirts where the cornfields were. It was 5 in the morning, and the sound of roosters started erupting out of the fields, like the sound of whales in the waving ocean. Daylight was approaching, and Sheriff Lloyd got a begrudging look on his face. He wanted the night to stay. It was their only chance to find the moon. They passed Wallace's farmhouse, where he knew his parents were fast asleep and unaware that he had been out all night, and where those Coors banquets waited in the mini-fridge on the porch. They drove on a little further until the sun began to triumph against the grayness of the sky. An orange and yellow watercolor washed away the gray. It looked like the sky was being mopped, a golden soap foaming and oozing over the earth. Sheriff Lloyd pulled his cruiser up to the side of the road where the corn stalks had caught some dehydrating illness and fell, making a parking lot of hay and straw. Everybody circled up and parked there too. Sheriff Lloyd got out and stretched. He was a silhouette in front of the bright backdrop of a sunrise. For a moment it was only him, just a black silhouette, holding its knees and bending over to fix its back after driving for so long. He came back up and stood up straight in front of the solar sky. The Old West was coming back for just that moment, and the moon was truly, deeply, gone. He looked out into the sunrise and squinted, but didn't really know how to feel. Tired, disappointed, hopeful, ashamed, hungry, tired. He leaned down again, sliding his hands over his knees, and groaned.
Oh, what have I done?
Wallace walked over to him, with the volleyball between his wrist and hip.
I think the search is over, buddy,
Sheriff Lloyd said while his face turned orange with sunlight. Wallace's hair turned a lighter shade of brown as the two of them squinted, standing in the morning light.
Is anyone hungry?
Sheriff Lloyd asked, turning to face the rest of the search party.
Anybody could use a cup of coffee?
Nobody answered, but everybody knew the answer. Luna had purple bags beginning to fade into existence beneath her eyes. Donnie looked twice as tired.
We probably shouldn't be driving so tired,
Sheriff Lloyd said while rubbing the sleep out of his face. We going to the diner? Wallace questioned. It opens at 7, Otis called out from his truck. It's only 5:51.
We'll wait here. Then we'll go get some coffee and breakfast.
There was a silent agreement, and silence agreeingly lasted in that spot, on the side of the road where morning broke. A lot of them were too tired to talk, too tired to sleep. The sunrise forbade them to sleep. Victims of their own biologies, they sat and yawned, stretching sometimes and rarely clearing their throats. The red-headed waitress sat them down at the counter of the town diner. They were the first ones in, and they were quite the party to look at. But waitresses are creatures that never judge. She kept a smile on her face as she poured black coffee into 6 white mugs. The steam wavered up to the steel rafters where old Pepsi posters and baseball posters hung. She let them skim the menus and put their cream and sugar into their coffees. Nobody said a word. They were still too tired to speak, and the sunlight coming in through the diner windows seemed to be coming from an entirely different planet. The waitress could have assumed they had all gotten up for work and were just tired from having to wake up too early. She took out her notepad with a kind of blissfulness and went around taking orders from the 6 members of the search party. Otis was the first to speak while they waited for their food. He told them about his Bigfoot encounter. Everyone sleepily listened. Had they not been so tired, maybe they would have laughed, teased him, gasped, and believed him. When their food came, Donnie and Jeannie talked about the state of modern music and old rock and Taylor Swift. I respect her. No, I respect her, but she's just not my thing, Donnie said before his plate of eggs and bacon. Jeannie shuffled on the stool. Oh, I can't stand her, she rasped. Maybe her country songs I like, but I don't like her now. I don't listen. My nieces love her, Otis chimed in with a mouthful. Oh, really? Donnie raised his eyebrows like it was surprising. He was truly surprised for some reason. Otis nodded, his jowls busy in chewing. Wallace ate buttermilk pancakes. An orange slice and some kind of green garnish came on the side, which he neglected, of course. The volleyball was in his lap. Luna had a plate of waffles that was topped with whipped cream and strawberries, the strawberries bleeding out into a thin red, into the cool white foam. Somebody shouted over the radio on Sheriff Lloyd's chest. Sheriff Lloyd, where are you? But he ignored it, chewing his steak and eggs with a kind of boredom in his eyes. The radio was ignored by everyone else as well. Donnie got a phone call from his wife, but he didn't answer it. Wallace got a phone call from his mother, but he didn't answer it. Luna got a phone call from her father, but she didn't answer it. They all just ate their food and drank their coffee. So, Wallace grunted to the sheriff, what's going to happen now?
They're gonna say I went rogue, and I did,
he answered, but he didn't sound too sad about it. Will you lose your badge? Wallace asked. The sheriff shrugged and took a gulp of his coffee that had cooled down. He sighed and answered,
I'm the only sheriff in town, and this town probably wants to keep its sheriff. I'll probably just be the laughingstock of the other stations in the surrounding towns.
Well, screw him, Wallace said. Sheriff Lloyd didn't react to this. He just looked over the counter, over the remnants of the yellow yolk on his plate. All right, boys and girls, Hilary O'Leal said when she sprung up from her desk after sending an angry text to her runaway husband. Get out last night's homework. I want to see how y'all did. She had vibrant eyes, sharp cheekbones, and curly brown hair that was graying. She wore a turquoise blouse with her lanyard around her neck. The sound of the students shuffling through their backpacks and other students racing to other classes in the hall sounded while Mrs. O'Leal turned to the whiteboard and saw something strange. She froze. In a corner of the whiteboard, near the replica skeleton, there was a little note written in black marker. She arched her brow as her lips departed in some kind of astonishment. It read, Sorry for leaving the toilet seat up, and sorry for making you mad. You know I always love you. Mrs. O'Leal gulped. She closed her mouth, and her shoulders collapsed as she sighed a relieving sigh. She turned around to face her class, leaving her husband's little note on the whiteboard. She would get home later that day after work to see that the toilet seat was down. Otis and Jeannie had lunch at Otis's house together. He cooked pork chops and they watched HGTV in his living room. He showed her his revolver and scopes in the garage afterward, and drove her home at 1 p.m. He napped after that, and though he didn't tell anyone, that night and morning was the best one of his life. Wallace's parents were at work when he got home after dropping Luna off. He shuffled upstairs and into his room, where he fell asleep with his sneakers still on. It was 9 in the morning when he fell asleep, and his parents came home to see their son asleep with probably a hell of an explanation for where he had been in the morning when they woke up for work. But they let him sleep. Luna had gone to sleep after Wallace dropped her off at that run-down shack of a home. She woke up at 2 in the afternoon, rubbing her eyes as she entered the kitchen. The fridge was riddled with magnets and ancient tests that she had passed. She opened it, got a piece of leftover pizza, and nibbled on it while looking out the window at the farmland that her father could never resurrect. Sheriff Lloyd got a month's suspension from the higher-ups at the mayor's office. A young buck would be taking his place. Wallace stumbled out of bed at 6:30 in the evening. He hobbled downstairs like Frankenstein's monster, wandered past his parents, who were watching Fox News in the living room, and he went into the kitchen to make himself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. There, "Where were you?" hovered in the living room. He left it hovering in there before coming in to answer them with a mouthful. His mother looked down from her Kindle, and his father turned down the volume on the television, as their son's story only got stranger and stranger. "You broke into the school?" his mother shrieked. But all Wallace did was shrug. A nondescript car pulled up outside, and out of it stepped Sheriff Lloyd in jeans and a white t-shirt, with a 6-pack of Budweiser in his hand. Wallace stepped out onto the front porch and saw the sheriff give a nondescript wave. Everything was groggy and nondescript. The ending of the day had never felt so dusty. "Put them in the fridge if you're planning on staying for a bit," Wallace said, nodding at the mini-fridge. Sheriff Lloyd stepped up on the porch, his boots making rustic thuds on the splintery stairs. There was an understanding between them that they didn't need to shake hands or hug. "So," Wallace said, leaning against a column while the sheriff stocked the mini-fridge, "what happened?"
I'm on a month's suspension, and I am now the laughingstock of all surrounded stations. And what happened with you?"
"I came home and slept," Wallace said. This made the sheriff smile a little. Sheriff Lloyd nodded to shake the smile off and looked out into the cornfield. "What about you?" Wallace spoke, nodding at the sheriff. "Did you get any sleep?"
"Just a couple hours,"
said the sheriff, cracking open a beer. "Hey, hand me one," Wallace said. The sheriff handed Wallace one of his Coors Banquets, and he cracked it open.
"Cheers,"
Sheriff Lloyd said, subtly lifting his bottle. It clinked against Wallace's can.
"To the moon,"
said the sheriff, before they sipped in synchronization. Mrs. Cannon came out and met the sheriff. She recognized him from her occasional trips to the grocery store, for sometimes he hung out there in uniform. She seemed pleased that her son was suddenly friends with the law, but Wallace left out one key detail of his story when he relayed it to his mother. Her cheeriness really made the mood on the front porch seem lighter. She went back inside. "Wally's friends with the sheriff now," she had said to her husband when entering. It was on both of their minds, but neither one felt like bringing it up. They didn't need to put it in words. They knew that if the moon didn't rise that night, then they would have to walk the cornfields in search of it. But it was when they were on their third beer that something appeared in the darkening horizon beyond the cornfield. The thin sliver of a crescent moon had started its climb into the sky.
"Huh, would you look at that?"
Wallace waited before saying. "Must have been hiding in the cornfields this whole time." And that is the end of the story. Thank you everyone for listening. Thank you so much to Nicholas Leonard, 1, for providing the story for the channel, and 2, for providing your voice for the character of Sheriff Lloyd. His Instagram will be linked in the description. As I mentioned, you should go give him a follow and check him out. He writes a lot of poetry, which is most of what his Instagram is. I'm not going to read any of that on the channel, sorry. I'm not really a poetry channel, but I glanced through it. Yes, it's not bad. Anyway, this section now is going to be my thoughts on this story, which I did ask Nicholas if I could put this in, so I'm not just going to shit on his writing for without checking with him first. But I'm going to start with the bad, and then go on to the good, because I would like to end on a positive note. Now, as far as bad goes, I don't actually have that much to say. My first and main one would be way too many descriptive metaphors. It's like, I get it. A thing looks like another thing with very artistic terms used. It's like, the only one I remembered is the one about the streetlights and the telephone poles bowing like dancers or whatever, something like that. All the other ones I forgot about. I don't think a story needs metaphors like that all the fucking time, like in every second paragraph. Too many of those. You know what? Some people might love them. I don't. You know what? Everyone likes different things, so whatever. I'm not a master of writing. So there's that. Two, now this is actually more a criticism of most modern writing, not just this story, but a lot of modern writers, I feel like, because they grew up with TV and movies, they write a lot more like screenplays than they do like stories. And I find in any scene transitions, especially in this one, like the transition between, what was his name, Donnie, uncapping the pen, and then like a sudden scene transition, that really just to me reads like a TV script, where it's like, we're not in a TV show, we're in a book, we're in a story. It's like, don't transition scenes, I don't need a cliffhanger scene. It's like, even George R. R. Martin does this too much. It's like, it feels like he's writing a TV script. Doesn't feel like he's writing a story. I don't like it. I'm sure, you know what, some people do, because all they do is watch TV, but it's like, you're writing a story, not a screenplay. Let me imagine things, and don't write like that. It's my 2 cents on that. I don't know if anyone agrees with me. If you do, tell me in the comments. So anything else bad? Is this story a advertisement for Coors Banquet? I don't know. It gets mentioned specifically by name, and it's the only beer mentioned by brand name in the whole thing, so I don't know. Maybe Nicholas is getting some kickback from Coors for that. I don't know. I noticed that and remembered it for some reason. I can't think of anything else particularly bad that I was struck by. As with all writers, run your story through a spell checker. There were a couple spelling mistakes in this that I fixed on my end when pronouncing, but yeah, check your grammar, check your spelling. Always do that, especially if you're a writer. Always pays off. Anyway, on to the good stuff. That's enough of that. So, first of all, I don't really know how to put this in particular terms, but reading the story, I wanted to get to the end. I wanted to figure out what was going on. So I'd say that's a big plus. I was very curious to see what would happen, and I wanted to keep reading, which to me is always the hallmark of a good story. So, props for that. It's a good premise and good setting. Oh, wait, that's one other thing. I feel like the story could have ended in the diner. I didn't need all the where are they now section, but, I don't know, some people like that. I don't really care for it. You could have ended in the diner, and I feel like nothing would have changed. Would have left a bit more mystery, but I still think the ending was good. I like the ending, but the diner scene and the part where they all get their, like, where are they now sections, I don't know. I didn't really need that. Didn't care. But yeah, I really wanted to figure out where the story was going, what was going to happen. That was very good. As for the characters, I thought the cast was a great, diverse set of characters. I know I have trouble with this one that I write, is that I tend to make all my characters just slightly different versions of the same person. Excuse me. So this was really good, because all the characters did feel like two different people. Donnie felt like, I don't know, I just pictured him in like a suit with his tie kind of slightly undone, and he's hungover, and I kept wanting to read him in an Italian accent for some reason, but I never did. I don't know. I liked him. Although far and away the standout characters of this whole thing are Otis and Jeannie. Holy shit, they are my absolute favorite. I want an entire story of just Otis and Jeannie fucking around in the woods being crazy, because they were my absolute stars of this story. When the line came up that Otis was talking about his fucking Bigfoot encounter, that was like the first line of a new page, and so I didn't see it until I scrolled down a bit, and when I did, I had to take a break from recording because I couldn't stop laughing. Otis was amazing, Jeannie was great. I want a story of just them. Mwah, beautiful characters. Luna, at first, I was like, oh, her name's Luna, it's a story about the moon. Is she the stand-in? And he's looking for her the whole time, blah, blah, blah. Like, you know the meme of the, you are my world, bro, that kind of thing. But then it didn't turn out that way, so, nice way to subvert expectations, but she did really seem like that trope of just the very positive, very smart, lovely girl who lives in the shitty rundown farm shack with her drunk dad who sucks. And, like, she's gonna end up falling in love with the main character. But it's nice that that never happened, that she was just there, hung around, helped out, and took off. Wallace, at the start, I thought he was a douchebag, didn't really like him. I just pictured him in a leather jacket, and he was like 16 and carried a knife all the time, thought he was really cool. Way too many sentences that described him flipping his hair out of his face, which really annoyed the shit out of me. But I think it's a good thing when you hate a character, because if a character evokes no emotion, that's when it's bad. But Wallace, I would not want to talk to him in life, and I'm sure if I met him, I would think he's a dickhead. So, yeah, fuck Wallace, Otis, and Jeannie forever. Luna was like a nothing character. Sheriff Lloyd, I don't know how to feel about him. Maybe it's because I didn't voice him, so I didn't feel like I really connected with the character at all, but I don't know. He's just kind of, I guess he was having a nice little, like, self-realization moment throughout the whole thing. Hanging out with some kids, having some beers on the porch in the end, looking for the moon, being a silly goose. Yeah, I don't know. Don't mind him. But yeah, Otis and Jeannie forever. They were my absolute favorite. So characters were great. The driving of the story was great. I really wanted to figure out what was going on. And I think that might be all I have to say. Overall, I'd say good story. Few issues with the writing, mostly because of metaphors and the way that all modern people write. But that's just me, because I read nothing but classics all fucking day, as you can see by this channel. So I'm acclimatized to nothing but the best of the best. So if you're not a world-famous writer, then I'm going to have a lot of problems with you. But all in all, I did like the story. It was good. Thank you again to Nicholas Leonard. Go check him out. You may see some more stories of his pop up on the channel. I don't know. I have no schedule. Things just show up as I feel like it. Anyway, thanks to you all for listening. Thanks again to Nicholas Leonard, and we will see you again for the next one. Have a good night. Bye.